Hello and welcome to the Health Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Holly B. Today I welcome back Sarah Bouchard. We had a really great conversation on our last episode that we did together, which was episode number 59, Finding Health, Freedom, and Peace Through Intuitive Eating. Sarah is a nutrition and mindset coach, and she works with women 35 and up, helping them break free of dieting, helping them eat more, build muscle, and love their body. Today, we are talking about hormones, specifically female hormones and the female cycle. So, we're going to dive into an overview of what a standard normal hormone cycle looks like, go through each of the phases so you know what to look for and you know what's going on in your body. And then we're going to talk about what hormone imbalance can look like, can feel like, what some of those symptoms are. And then we're going to tie that into histamines and how histamines can present when there is hormone dysregulation or hormone imbalance. So this is a really interesting topic. It was actually a new one for me. I didn't really realize how histamines tied into the female cycle when there is imbalance. And so we're going to look at that topic, look at what that looks like. And without getting too complicated with it, we will give you some actionable tips on how to test for hormone imbalance to see where your hormones are functioning and if they need regulation. And then we're going to talk about some easy steps on how to step into that world of, okay, I have some dysregulation here, I have some imbalance. Now what? And now what steps might be best for me to take to start the process of regulation? Before we dive in, as always, I would love to ask you to take a moment to give us a like, to subscribe, and if you feel called to leave us a review. This podcast is such a passion project of mine. I love doing it so much. I love being able to present you with different options for your health journey, different ways of viewing health, viewing the body. So it means a lot to me. It helps this podcast grow. So thank you so much for taking a moment to do that. And now let's dive into the episode with Sarah. Sarah Bouchard, welcome back to the Health Bridge podcast. I'm so excited to do episode number 2 with you. We talked a lot about nutrition in our first episode, and we're going to be talking about that again, but really more in relation to female hormones and what hormone imbalance can look like for women, what it can feel like, and how it relates to histamines, which is something that I never really knew much about until more recently after we started talking and I started doing some research on it. So this is definitely going to be an interesting topic. I feel like any woman out there can relate to this in some form or fashion. I think why don't we start by let's talk about just the overall, what does the female cycle look like in somebody that's totally normal, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, totally. Let's start there. And it took me a long time to have this ingrained in my brain because you look at the chart and there's so many moving parts. And I think just for simplicity's sake, today let's stick with estrogen and progesterone. We're going to leave LH and FSH to the side because I don't think we're having a fertility conversation. So I don't think that matters today. And we're going to dive into it from just that standpoint of progesterone and estrogen and what a regular quote unquote female cycle looks like. So obviously it starts at day 1, and the first day is the first day of the bleed cycle or the menstrual cycle. For most women, that will last from 1 to 5 days, or 2 to 5 days, pardon me. 2 days would be a little bit shorter, and then 6-7 days would be a little bit longer. And the length of the bleed cycle can sometimes have different meaning. But we're not going to go there. We're just going to talk about a brief overview of what the cycle looks like. So the bleed is going to last about 5 days on average, and that is a part of the follicular phase of the cycle, which lasts typically around 14 days. The average female cycle, I think, lasts around 28 days. But then again, there are a lot of females who have a shorter or longer cycle. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your cycle is unhealthy if it's a little bit longer or shorter. For the first 5 days when the female is bleeding, progesterone and estrogen are going to be like almost completely flat. So this is largely why women feel quite low energy during that time of the month for the most part. There's just like almost zero hormones at that stage of the cycle. And then slowly around usually day 7 or 8, estradiol is going to start slowly peaking, and it's going to pretty much reach its peak a few days before ovulation. Ovulation, or the ovulatory phase, is going to start typically around day 12 to 14. That begins when there's a surge in LH and FSH, which again, those are not important for today's conversation. The estrogen levels will decrease during that surge, and the progesterone will start to increase. So this is what happens around ovulation. That's typically day 12 or 14. Then we start the luteal phase, which is typically starting right after ovulation on day 14, more or less. For some females, that may be a little bit later. So from that point on, what happens to hormones generally is estrogen will be in a little bit of a dip, and it will stabilize at somewhat of a higher level. And progesterone will start rising after ovulation and then reach its peak somewhere in the middle / end of the luteal phase. So you're going to have different peaks and valleys throughout the cycle. For every female, that's a little bit different, but generally speaking, for women that haven't entered perimenopause, this is what a healthy hormonal cycle looks like. And now the caveat is, for women that have entered perimenopause, those hormone fluctuations are going to be very erratic. And this is when symptoms can start manifesting. I mean, the thing is, it can be hard to differentiate, am I in perimenopause or do I just have a hormonal imbalance, right? We might dive into perimenopause a little bit later, but I think for today's conversation, we're just going to talk about a regular female cycle. So this is what happens to hormones. And for a lot of females, they're going to be told, if they have hormonal imbalance, that they have estrogen dominance. And that can be the case, but it's not necessarily always the case that the estrogen levels are super high. So I'll give you an example. For me, I did what's called a Dutch test. And for the audience, Dutch test is dry urine test for comprehensive hormones. And you can order that test through a functional medicine practitioner or a naturopath. Most GPs will not order that test. But I did that test a few years ago to find out what was happening with my hormones. And I found out, and I was quite surprised, that my estrogen was actually quite low. And so was my progesterone. What was happening was that I think it was my phase 2 estrogen detox pathway was plugged. It wasn't working properly. And that cycle is closely related to methylation, which is, again, a whole different topic, but it at least brought me to this place where I knew what to do and I knew where to start and I knew what was going on with my hormones. So for me, symptoms that were manifesting were lack of energy, especially during the first phase of the cycle. I was completely exhausted. Like the first week of my cycle, not only were my periods horrible, but I was really exhausted. I had no energy. So that was low estrogen. My periods were really painful and heavy. I had migraines often. This is something very interesting. Almost every month on day 5 or day 6 of my period, I had a migraine. And I didn't notice that for years. But once I started tracking my cycle and logging my symptoms, it was like on the dot every month, migraine on day 5 or day 6. So for females out there that perhaps have a monthly migraine, might be a good idea to start tracking when it's happening. And I no longer have that migraine on day 5 or day 6, and I'll explain later what I think helped with that. Migraines, mood swings, acne, constipation, diarrhea, you name it, like female hormones can have so many downstream effects on our bodies. And it can be really hard to keep track of what's causing what. Yeah. So I think that's an overview of the female cycle in general, what that looks like. And then just for the ladies out there that are listening, that are thinking, I think I have hormonal imbalance. If you resonate with a lot of the symptoms I've just mentioned, there's a good chance that you might have hormonal imbalance, quote unquote.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of that. I've had fluctuating cycles basically since I stopped taking birth control, which
Mm,
was, I don't know, 15 years ago probably.
yeah.
And since then, it's definitely stabilized, but it still can be up and down. I still haven't put 100% of my effort into
Yeah.
fixing this because there's so many things, right, that I am also doing for other things in my life.
Yep.
One thing that I had determined, not through testing, but just through learning about my cycle, what I hypothesized was I was also likely low in estrogen, but also low in progesterone. So there's that question of, and I didn't test to confirm this, but there's that question of like, where are my ratios? And
Mhm.
is estrogen where it's supposed to be and I'm extra low in progesterone, or am I low in estrogen and low in progesterone? And what I determined was I think I was likely low. I think like you were in both, but progesterone especially low.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough to know because so if you go to a regular GP and you ask your GP, I would like to test my hormones. So I just had a client actually who did this and her GP only tested her estrogen and her LH for some reason, even though she's my age and she's not trying to conceive, and didn't test her progesterone. And he tested her, I think, on day 21, which is fairly typical for practitioners to test on that day. That's when I did my Dutch test as well, because you're not going to see any progesterone if you test on like day 5 or day 6, right? So you want to test for progesterone when it's likely going to be at its highest. But if you go to your GP and you ask them to test your hormones, you have to be very specific. And most of them are probably not going to test both, and they're not going to test different estradiol metabolites. You're only going to have one number and you're not going to have the ratios, and you're going to be missing the big picture. This would be like someone who wants to test their thyroid and goes to a GP. They're just going to test TSH probably, right? So whole other conversation. But basically, if you want functional testing, go to a functional practitioner. Don't go to a GP. And for me, when I did the Dutch test, the results were showing that I had low progesterone and low estradiol. And the estrogen was still, I think it would have still been considered estrogen dominance because the estrogen was still much too high for how little progesterone I had. But my estrogen levels were still considered low, which was really interesting to me because nobody had ever mentioned that to me. Like anytime I talked to a naturopath and had a conversation with someone that had hormonal problems, they were talking about estrogen dominance. That was always the kind of the term that was whipped around. Like that was like every woman's problem. And what doesn't get acknowledged is that doesn't necessarily mean that your estrogen is high. What that meant for me was, okay, so how do I bump up both hormones and become better at detoxifying my phase 2 pathway? And so I started working with a naturopath to do that. And I started taking HRT, bioidentical hormonal replacement therapy. At first, I started with progesterone only. And after several months of doing progesterone only, I felt really good during my luteal phase, which is when your progesterone is higher, and my energy levels were really good. I started feeling stronger and just overall felt better. But I was still really struggling in the first phase of my cycle, which is where your estrogen is supposed to start rising, right? And obviously, levels of estrogen are going to be low in the first few days of your cycle, but mine were too low. And now that I knew that, I knew it was a problem. And every cycle, that migraine that came up on day 5 or day 6, once I started taking the estradiol, the replacement therapy for estradiol, after a few months, that headache went away. And I haven't had that headache on day 5 or day 6 since. So this is just an example of, how number one, going to your GP for hormonal imbalance is not going to be helpful. But also number two, like, the hormonal system is very complex, and it's just not as simple as testing one hormone. It's understanding the ratios, tracking your symptoms. So I encourage every female that's listening to start tracking their cycle, write down symptoms, start noticing when things are happening, right? If you have a headache on day 5 or day 6 every month, it's important to know that, right? And then the other thing, which is going to lead us, this is a perfect segue, this is going to lead us into our next topic that we want to talk about that's related to this, is when you start tracking your cycle and you start understanding the hormonal fluctuations, you might notice that you have problems around when your estrogen starts to peak, which is right before ovulation. And what happens is, so we're going to talk about histamines now. And hang on, let me just backtrack a little bit. So for people that are not familiar with what histamines are, they're chemicals that your cells make. They are primarily released by mast cells, which are immune cells. And often histamines are known for things like allergies, seasonal allergies, right? People will take antihistamines, but we don't talk about histamines often in the context of hormones. And this is a key piece for a lot of females, because if you have hormonal imbalance and you think you have a lot of symptoms that are due to hormonal imbalance, it's very likely that a majority of those symptoms are actually histamine intolerance symptoms. Not saying it is, but it's very likely.
Yeah, the histamine thing is interesting because this is something that I have never studied before.
Yeah.
So, in preparation for this, I've been doing a lot more reading about it. And I've always only known histamines really to be problematic for people with seasonal allergies, like you're saying, or perhaps with some food allergies or
Yeah.
sensitivities. And I didn't really realize how important histamine is in the body just for standard functioning. Like, it's important for your energy level, for waking you up in the morning. It's important for your immune system. It's like important in all these other systems.
Mm-hmm.
And because seasonal allergies and stuff are so maybe rampant in today's society for a million reasons that is again a whole nother topic. And where everybody just take an antihistamine. Oh, I need my Zyrtec pill or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think we just don't give them the importance and the respect maybe that these histamines actually deserve. They are actually a crucial part of our health.
They are. Yeah, they play a massive role. And I like that you mentioned that they're not all bad, right? So you mentioned they help keep you awake and they help with, making you feel awake. And that's an important part of understanding that histamines are not all negative. They have an important function in the body. I think it's really helpful to think about histamines in the context of everyone has a cup, right? Everyone has a histamine cup or a histamine bucket. And if your histamine bucket overflows, this is when you get in trouble. This is when you have the symptoms. But you shouldn't have an empty cup either, right? And you can't. Histamines are in your body, right? And they get released under certain circumstances, and that's perfectly normal. You can't stop that process, but you have to understand how the histamine bucket works, and you have to have the tools in your toolkit to reduce the load where you can, when you think it's appropriate, and also get better at oh my God, can you say that word for me? French problems.
Me-
Metabolizing those histamines. So it's not, again, right? There's so much nuance in these conversations. It's not a matter of, oh, histamines are horrible and I need to stop consuming all the histamine rich foods, or I need to get rid of histamines completely. You can't. And by the way, if you take an antihistamine, it's just a Band-Aid solution. And most likely that's going to make you really sleepy, right? So you can't just take that pill and hope to fix a problem. Once again, it's about just addressing the root cause and getting better at understanding why these things are happening in your body. And when it comes to the connection with estrogen, increases histamine in the body and links to the immune system via receptors on your immune cells. So mast cells not only release histamine, but they also have receptors for estrogen. When estrogen binds to these receptors, more histamine is released from mast cells in your uterus. So the more estrogen you have in your body, again, think too much estrogen or a lack of ability to detoxify estrogen would be more appropriate. The more estrogen you have in your body, the more histamine is released. And this is where it gets tricky, because while estrogen can trigger histamine release, histamine can also increase estrogen production. So it's a massive vicious cycle. And on top of that, estrogen may also slow down diamine oxidase production, which is DAO production. And that's an enzyme that breaks down histamine in the gut. So if you have too much estrogen, it's just like it never stops, right? And I think this is the cycle that I was stuck in for multiple years. And once I started being aware of that, and let me just be perfectly honest with the listener, like, it's not like I completely got rid of all of the symptoms associated with that, but it's like 80% better.
which is huge.
Yeah, there is something people can do, right? But
Right.
it starts with awareness, and it starts with tracking and noticing the symptoms when they're happening. What foods are you eating? What symptoms are you experiencing when, right? It has to start with that awareness.
Yeah. And just to recap on what you just said,
Yeah.
so if you're noticing issues, this could potentially be the problem, right? The hormone estrogen stimulates the mast cells to actually produce histamine or release histamine,
Yeah. Yeah.
while also reducing the DAO enzyme,
Yeah.
which is there to take care of the histamines when you have it, right?
Yeah.
Then the histamine present stimulates the release of luteinizing hormones. Those luteinizing hormones causes gradual increase in estrogen. So it is this like cycle that just keeps building on itself and building on itself.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to further add to that problem, progesterone, which tends to be low or off balance for people with estrogen dominance, or at least tends to be low in the phase of the cycle around day 7, 8, 9, 10, where estrogen rises, progesterone is low. And that makes the problem worse, because low progesterone will make histamine release even worse, because it slows down excess histamine. So
Got it.
progesterone is like the hormone that you want to help you with high histamine.
Got it. So in an ideal cycle, it's balancing itself out so that the
Yeah,
histamine, that histamine cycle doesn't get out of control, basically, or out of
exactly.
proportion. But when the
Exactly.
progesterone is low, that's when it's not taking care of that situation for you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. If progesterone is much lower than it needs to be, and if you, and this is the part where a lot of practitioners talk about if estrogen is high, but I would reframe that and say if you are not detoxifying estrogen properly, right? And this is something that a lot of practitioners miss. Like, when I did my Dutch test and I realized, oh, but my estrogen is not even high, it's just that my detox pathway is not working properly. And
So
once I
it's
started supporting that.
Yeah, so it's essentially, even though you have low estrogen, it's presenting in the body as high simply because you're not getting rid of it efficiently.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so this is like the whole histamine hormonal relationship broken down for the listener. And it's overwhelming because at first it feels like there is nothing that can be done, but there is. And again, start with working with a practitioner, do a Dutch test, do a deep dive, start tracking your cycles, start tracking your symptoms. And the more information you can give to your practitioner, the better equipped your practitioner is going to be to make appropriate recommendations and perhaps work with you to prescribe bioidentical HRT, right? Work with someone that's willing to do that and that's going to listen to you when you talk about your symptoms and that's going to get feedback from you, right? That's super important.
It is important. You need somebody that's gonna listen to you.
Yeah.
But like you said, the more prepared you can be, the
Yeah.
better, because you can state your case better to the person that can help you balance. So
Yeah.
let's talk about creating balance. What did you do besides just the HRT therapy?
Yeah.
How did you address this with your day-to-day life and your nutrition habits?
Yeah. What's interesting is I think I mentioned this earlier. I can't remember if it was on the record or off the record, but I mentioned that when I started taking the progesterone, I had an improvement in symptoms and I had more energy and I felt really good in that second phase of the cycle, which I think was related most likely to the whole histamine thing, right? It was helping me with the histamine. But so when you do HRT, you take progesterone for 14 days in your luteal phase. You don't take progesterone in the first phase of your cycle because that's not physiological, right? Why would you be doing that? In a female that's not perimenopausal, you wouldn't be producing progesterone in that phase of your cycle. It would be extremely low. So I was taking progesterone from day 14 to day 28, and that was improving my symptoms. But in the first phase of my cycle, I was still very symptomatic. And when I started taking the bioidentical estradiol from about day 1 to day 14, that improved a lot of my issues with energy. I had a lot more energy and stamina, but I still had really horrible histamine symptoms. And in fact, they started getting worse after a while. And this is partly my fault because I didn't work on the estrogen detox pathway that I saw from the test. I was neglecting that and I was over focused on the HRT. So that's one thing that really helped is when I started taking supplements for estrogen detox. And this is something that you have to talk to your naturopath or your functional medicine practitioner about. Like there's so many different things that you can take, and it really has to be tailored to you and where you're at and your symptoms. But I started doing that and I started being very aware of histamine foods. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because I really love a high protein diet. This is how I feel my best. And also, just to be perfectly honest, I just really love a good steak. Like, this is what I like eating. I like eating meat. That's what I crave. And so I've been doing a very high animal protein diet for quite a while. And interestingly, when I started doing the animal-based diet, where obviously eat mostly animal protein, and you lower your fiber considerably, even though I was still eating fruit, but my fiber intake was much, much lower than it had previously been. This is when my symptoms were at their worst. And that was before the HRT. That was several years ago. And where I'm going with this is once you have the awareness, you're working with a doctor and you're perhaps on HRT, perhaps targeting estrogen detox with supplements, I think it's really important and perhaps you do that first, to target your foods, your histamine foods, and try to minimize that, especially around the time of the month where estrogen is high. So for me, like the probably like between day 7 and day 14, I'm going to really watch my histamine foods. So for the listener, not all animal protein is going to be horrible for histamines. I think aged meats are going to be more detrimental. Cured meats are really high in histamines, like any deli meats or like prosciutto, things like that.
Canned
Ferments,
and canned fish, like
canned
tuna,
fish.
stuff like that.
Yep, totally. Yeah, canned fish, seafood in general, actually. And that's really funny because I never had issues with any allergies in my life, any food allergies in my life. I had like intolerances, but never an allergy. And a few years ago, that was again after doing animal based for several months. For the first time ever, I had a food allergy or food like an allergic reaction. I was eating mussels and my throat started closing off and it started being really itchy. And I had never experienced that before. Again, like that was a high histamine food, and my body was just like completely maxed out with the amount of histamines it was able to break down. And it was showing me the signs, right there. Seafood, you're probably going to want to stay away from as much as possible, especially during the high estrogen phase. Fermented foods, kimchi, sauerkraut, kefir, all of those health foods that we're told to eat. Bone broth, unfortunately, is really high in histamines as well, and that includes collagen, right? So collagen powder and bone broth are really high in histamines. And then after that, you have things like alcohol. And this is like one of the reasons why I wasn't able to tolerate alcohol for the last few years. And I didn't really understand why. But yeah, so I don't drink alcohol and I find that helps a ton. Sorry, I know for my ladies out there who like their wine, that's going to be heartbreaking. And then after that, some people say eggs are high in histamines. I don't have a problem when I eat eggs, but that's again, like at that point, I've already eliminated or reduced all of these other things. So maybe it doesn't matter as much. Maybe for someone who has like a massive overload of histamines, they need to be more careful. Avocados are supposedly very high in histamines. So like if you're doing like keto or low carb, like pretty much everything you eat is a histamine food, right? I know it's like super counterintuitive because a lot of females out there who are trying to do low carb, keto, whole food, like even doing it like the right way, you could be shooting yourself in the foot big time with all those foods. Um,
Yes. So basically, when we're trying these other diets to see what vibes with us, and I encourage people to try things. I definitely am a fan of seeing what works for you, but we can't I feel like we can't necessarily always blame the diet
no.
because we're not taking into account what other factors that are happening in our body that we aren't aware of yet, right? Like you weren't aware of the histamine issue
Mm-hmm.
relating to the hormones at that point.
Yeah.
And perhaps if you would have started that diet after you had handled the hormone issues,
Yeah.
gotten that back on track, maybe it wouldn't have presented the same way. So I
Yeah.
just want to throw that out there because I think it's easy, especially when we're talking about things that sound extreme, like the
Yeah.
carnivore diet or the animal based diet, or even on the flip side, a vegan diet. Like,
Mhm.
can't, it's easy to want to blame the extreme diet
Yeah.
when it could be just that other factors aren't in place to let that diet do what it could do for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a time and a place for every diet. I think the animal-based diet can be really fantastic for people in a certain situation with their own genetic predispositions and what their body is going through at that particular time versus somebody else is going to do horribly with it. Again, like it has to be about manifestation of symptoms and your own quality of life and how you react to something at a particular point. And you might do differently at a different time in your life with that same diet, right? So it's not all black or white, obviously.
Where do we want to like direct the listeners
Yeah.
if they are getting overwhelmed by what we're talking about here?
Yeah.
Because it is a lot of information and we just listed a heck of a lot of food
Yeah.
that sounds like we shouldn't be eating if we're dealing with histamine stuff. So,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
where do you suggest somebody
Yeah.
starts to dive into this or
Yeah.
adjust their
Yeah.
diet accordingly?
Yeah. I know it's tricky. And you and I were talking about that earlier. I think once again, it really depends on the individual. because some people are going to have issues that are so much deeper than all of this, and they're going to change one thing and it's going to aggravate the other, and it's like, okay, now what? Right? And it can feel really discouraging for people. So it really depends on the individual. If you are experiencing all of these symptoms, I would start by tracking, paying attention to it. Is this even a problem for you? Right? And once you have a suspicion that, yes, I think this is a problem, then I would start as much as possible reducing foods that are high in histamine, like the highest offenders, like aged meats, aged cheeses, fermented foods, alcohol. Start there. Don't go crazy with like eggs and bananas and avocados quite yet, but like eliminate the biggest offenders. Start tracking your cycle, start tracking your symptoms, start paying attention to what's going on there, and potentially work with a functional practitioner to do a Dutch test and see what your hormones are doing, and more of like a ratio, right? Like you want that ratio of estrogen, progesterone, and then you want to see what your metabolites are doing and whether or not you're detoxifying estrogens properly. So that would be another thing that I would address. And then from that point on, I would work with someone that can help you dial down your nutrition and your lifestyle factors that has experience with this if you feel like it's overwhelming, because it can be like a really long journey. I started diving down that rabbit hole probably a couple of years ago, and I want to say for the listener, my whole life I struggled with my cycle so much. And I always had to take multiple drugs, like painkillers, during the first 7 days of my cycle because I was in pain and I just could barely function. I had like ovarian cysts removed. I was told I had endometriosis. And about, I don't know, 3 months ago, I had my first period where I didn't feel like I needed to take painkillers. And this last cycle was my first period I ever remember in my adult life where I had zero cramps, zero. So it's possible. And it's certainly not linear. I don't expect it to be like that all the time, but I do think that it is something that people can address. It just requires a lot of awareness, persistence, patience, self-love. I know it sounds cheesy, like those days where you're just struggling, you have to keep trying your best and acknowledge that it's not linear and it's all going to be okay. I do think that people can figure it out.
I love that you said that. Just, it's not linear. We don't know what we don't know. We have
Yeah.
to experiment and we have to give ourselves grace and like patience in that process.
Mhm.
And the first practitioner we work with may or may not be like the one that gets us.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So don't feel like you can't shop around a bit. Like you're
Mhm.
not stuck with the first person you try to work with here.
Mhm.
So it's not like working within your healthcare where you're assigned a doctor and it's a lot harder to shift in that. Like
Mhm.
we're talking about naturopaths, functional medicine,
Mhm.
hormone practitioners. Like
Yeah.
this is our choice and we get to shop around.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to do. And again, like when it comes to the diets, experiment with supplements, experiment with hormone replacement, but also know that those things like I used to work in the supplement department of a pharmacy,
Yeah.
and we'd have women that would come in to return a bottle of a supplement after using it for a week
Yeah.
for their adrenal fatigue or for their hormones, and like, nope, this isn't working. It's like
Yeah.
your body didn't even taste it yet. These
Yeah.
things
Oh,
take
yeah.
time to shift.
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
once you get to our age and you're in your 40s and you've been dealing with hormone imbalance for probably the majority of your adult life, like things don't shift overnight like that. So
No.
you
No.
have to go into this knowing this is like a long haul project.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And it's hard because when people have a reduced quality of life because of their symptoms and they've tried everything, they're like, give me the freaking magic pill already. Like, I'm ready for the solution. I will do anything it takes, right? So I understand that frustration. I've been there multiple times, like completely breaking down and crying, like, what do I need to do now?
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I just want to say there is hope. And I think the female cycle and this whole relationship to histamine doesn't get addressed enough, and it's a massive issues for females. So I would encourage every female to start tracking if they're not already doing so and start paying attention to those symptoms and see what happens. And another thing that I want to talk about very briefly in regards to all of this, which is perhaps something that people can address to see if it helps, is there's two parts. So talking earlier about my experience and like trying a million different diets. And when I did animal based, my symptoms got worse. And again, not to blame it on animal based diet. There's a lot of great things about that diet. It's very nutrient dense, right? But for me personally, I think there was a lot of animal foods, a lot of histamine rich foods, and there was not enough fiber to help me detoxify that estrogen. And fiber, we know, is very important for estrogen detox. And this is something that I forgot about for a while. And then when I started reintroducing those fiber rich foods, like the brassica vegetables, for example, I started noticing a reduction in symptoms. So that was something that really helped me. Again, like some people have really bad gut issues or autoimmune issues. It's not going to be an appropriate recommendation for everyone. But it's something to keep in mind, right? That like try it out, see if it helps. If you can't deal with the fiber, then maybe try a sulforaphane supplement because that will give you some of the benefit without having all the fiber. And then another thing that I didn't get to mention earlier is that I was talking about that detox pathway for me that was not working properly. And a lot of that problem stemmed from a problem of methylation. So my body isn't methylating properly. And so that means I'm not absorbing nutrients properly and I'm not detoxifying properly. And so once I started targeting supplements that support methylation, again, it's hard because I did change several things at a time and it's hard to know which one did what, but I really do think that helped me. Again, I'm not a naturopath, so I don't want to tell people what to take, but these are the things that really helped. For me, it was folate. So not folic acid, but methylfolate, methylated form of folate. That was super helpful for me. And the caveat here, I track my food and I track my nutrients, and almost every single day, I'm not consuming enough folate to support methylation. And I eat like 100% whole food diet. So if I'm not getting enough folate, there's a good chance most people are not getting enough folate. So I started supplementing that. And I also started supplementing B6. Again, this is one of the B vitamins that's really crucial for methylation. And when I started tracking, I started noticing like I was really high in B12, but I was a little bit low in B6. And again, like people can take a B complex and the ratios are not always exactly what you need. Paying attention to that might be helpful. This is one of the reasons why I encourage my clients to track their food intake. It's because they can notice where the nutrients are at. And for me, it was like, oh, holy crap, I'm almost always not consuming enough folate, not consuming enough B6. This is probably one of the problems. Yeah, just even more awareness there can be super helpful as well.
Question for you about the vitamin Bs. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but when I was tracking for a little bit with the app that you suggested, which maybe we'll put in the show notes for people that need a tracking app, I do take a methylated B complex. And I was always sky high on the B12s, but I think lower on the others.
Yeah.
And Bs are water soluble. So you're going to pee out whatever, right? So if I am taking that, but I'm high in the B12, am I going to pee out the B12, but hold on to the folate?
I would think so. I don't know for sure the answer to that, but I did some blood tests not that long ago and my B12 was sky high as well. And I talked to the naturopath about it because I was like, oh, like super high B12 can be a sign of your kidneys not functioning properly. Should I be worried about this? And he said, you're supplementing with a B complex and you're eating a super high animal protein diet. of course, you're going to be higher in B12. And he said, your number is not nearly in the range where I would be concerned about kidney dysfunction or kidney illness. So he wasn't concerned about it. And he said exactly what you said, which is you're just going to pee out the excess. So
Yeah.
based on what he told me, I'm not worried about it. But just from like a pure functional standpoint, do I want to supplement with something I don't need, or do I just want to take what I need? And either way, I don't think it really matters that much if you're going to pee it out. But if you're constantly noticing that you're having these issues, folate, which is B9, and B6 are probably going to be the ones that you want to look at the most.
That makes sense. Yeah. We did not talk, or did we talk? I don't think we talked yet about perimenopause. Is there anything, any detail you want to talk about there? Because I know in my research it said that when women hit perimenopause, a lot of times that's when they'll develop histamine issues.
Yeah, yeah, big time. Yeah, I mean, all those things for me happened at the same time. Like I started manifesting all these symptoms, and I think I was around 37 when I started manifesting symptoms of perimenopause, and then the symptoms of histamine intolerance showed up not that long after. And it's really so, people use a word like, oh, balance your hormones online, right? Like the influencers or the coaches will say like, oh, do this to balance your hormones. And it's like when you're in perimenopause, there's no such thing as balancing your hormones. Like to a degree, like, yeah, you can improve the ratios and you can better at detoxifying, but like your hormones inherently are going to be more erratic if you're in perimenopause, especially if you're not taking HRT, right? So for me, the fluctuations manifested as like things like insomnia during PMS, really horrible hot flashes during certain times of the month. Again, like just like erratic hormones, because like when you have really rapid drops in hormones, that can happen. So those were like quite horrible, and they have been a lot better since taking HRT. I don't know if those symptoms are necessarily related to histamine in particular. It's really hard to differentiate what's histamine and what's just like hormonal imbalance or perimenopause. But in perimenopause, in perimenopause, it can feel a lot more erratic. Like it's a lot less easy to identify exactly what is happening at which time, because it's not like I was telling you offline, like with the hormones of a regular cycle, it's like this, right? And like with perimenopause, it's like this. So it's like just like up and down. And it can be a little bit trickier to pinpoint what's happening. For me, once again, like the lifestyle changes that we've talked about earlier with the diet, paying attention to histamine overload and like the biggest offenders has been super helpful.
Yeah, there's just so much here. There's so much nuance. I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, it just takes a lot of experimentation, a lot of testing
Oh, yeah.
I think is really important rather than just guessing at it.
Yeah, I wish I had tested sooner, because if I think of like how many years I was thinking like, oh, like maybe I should test my hormones, and I was like, oh, but the Dutch test is not cheap, right? And some insurance plans will cover some of it or all of it. I know I had to pay out of pocket, and I'm in Canada here, and it was like a $500 test. So I was just procrastinating taking it because of the money piece. But if I think of like how much money I would have saved, literally like not missing work and not spending money on supplements that were useless, I should have taken it sooner. I don't want to say should have, but like, yeah, I probably should have. This is where I would say it's not that you should start one thing before the other. It's like if you have all of these problems and your quality of life is diminished considerably, like try to do all of these things as soon as you can in manageable steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that want to maybe pick your brain on this a little bit further,
Yeah.
where can they reach you?
They can find me on Instagram. This is mostly where I'm active. Don't look at my website. It's really old and outdated, so don't go there. But Sarah Bouchard Nutrition is my Instagram. So you can find me there, and you can send me a DM if you're interested in working with me, or if you have some questions, I'd be happy to chat with you.
Awesome. Sarah, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet, that or anything you want to leave the listeners with?
Oh, I think we covered a lot. I don't want you and I were debating on how deep to dive into this today because there's so much to cover, but I wanted to keep it somewhat relatively surface
Digestible.
level. So, yeah, so people can digest it and have some actionable steps on where they go if they have some of these symptoms. So yeah, just basically what I want to leave the listener with is be patient and start with awareness. Just start there. Start noticing when and what things are happening.
Perfect. Sarah, this was a great conversation. I learned a lot too. So I'm so glad that you suggested this topic. And
I'm so glad to hear.
yeah, I'm going to be doing some hormone testing soon. So maybe
Oh,
we
yeah.
could do a part two or an Instagram live when I get my results back. We'll see.
I love that idea. Yeah, keep me posted for sure.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
So I'm curious, assuming you are a female listening to this, how much of that information was new to you? A lot of it was new to me. As I said in the episode, I've had so many health issues going on with me over the years that I've looked into my hormone issues or my cycle issues somewhat, but I've never really fully dove into like a healing journey with my cycle. And I didn't know about the histamine issue. And I'm in menopause now, and not menopause, I'm in perimenopause at this point. I'm in my mid 40s. And I have definitely noticed some histamine issues, primarily around when I'm eating. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say for me because this also correlated with me going animal based. So it's hard to know which one is which, or if it's a combination of both, right? Which is affecting the histamine. Definitely a lot more to learn here on this topic, but I think that Sarah gave a great overview and we left you with some great things to talk about or to think about and to potentially start trying as far as the diet changes and things like that. And then definitely getting deeper on the hormone testing. So you can really see for sure where you're at and know if this is something that you need to address or not. So, as I said, my next step is going to be getting back to the doctor and getting on the hormone testing, see what I can get done through my regular practitioner, and then potentially diving into some deeper testing with some functional medicine or naturopath practitioners. And I will definitely keep you all posted on how that goes and what steps that brings into my daily healthcare routine. I was talking with Sarah prior to recording, and we were saying it's always something like it can get to the point where it can be overwhelming, right? Just taking care of ourselves properly. And we've both been through cycles where we're doing well and then something else comes up, and we're doing well and then something else comes up. And you get to a point where you're just like, dude, what else? And you're just like, you can't help but cry about it. And then, but both of us, we always bring it back to there's something new to learn here. And whatever I'm going to learn is going to help somebody else. So I just want to remind you that health is a lifelong journey, right? Personal growth is a lifelong journey. This isn't something where we reach an end goal and then we're just floating from here on out, right? Like there's always going to be things that come up. There's always going to be things that shift. And it's just part of human life that we have to say, okay, how do I adjust for this now? What do I need to know? What do I need to do? And even though it can be overwhelming, I just want to encourage you to to look at it as an empowerment process, right? Learning these things and getting more deeply in tune with our bodies and what our bodies are asking from us. That is an empowering process. With that note, if you're ready to empower yourself with more health knowledge for your journey and you'd like a guide in that because again it can be an overwhelming process, please reach out to me. I am currently taking clients. You can apply for a free clarity call with me, which should be linked below, or find me on my Instagram at I am Holly Beck and get in touch with me there in the DMs and let's start chatting. Let's see if working together could be the right fit for you this year. And let's level you up. Let's get you going on a positive path with your health and with your mind. All right. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the Health Bridge podcast.